Hi there, welcome to Unit 4 on fungi. This is lesson 4.1, and we'll be looking at the root symbiotic arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi today. We'll introduce the kingdom of fungi in a very small snapshot. We'll look at the symbiotic mycorrhizal fungi and the two different types, the arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi as well as the ectomycorrhizal fungi, just as a short introduction. Then we'll start getting into more detail about what these arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi actually are and how they function. And eventually, in the next couple of lessons, we'll look at how they interact with plants and why they're so essential for plant growth and soil restoration. All right, without further ado, let's start lesson 4.1. So the kingdom of fungi, called mycota, is a very, very biodiverse kingdom. It is very complex, and taxonomists are still struggling to really classify or put fungi in their right relationships to one another. And so this really depends on not only how they look, which how fungi and other organisms have always been studied, but also now with the advent of molecular genetics or molecular analyses, it's becoming constantly reshuffled. So things change all the time, and it is a very difficult and complex area of study, trying to correctly classify the kingdom of fungi. The only three phyla that we'll be actually dealing with in this course are the Glomeromycota, which are the arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi that you can see pictured here. And they are very unique, and some scientists say that perhaps they need to have their own kingdom just because they're very unique in how they actually function and their relationship to plants, and they are just very, very unique. The other two groups we'll be looking at belong to the phylum Dicaria and are called Basidiomycota and Ascomycota. The ectomycorrhizal fungi that we'll look at, which are also the plant symbiotic fungi, are in the Basidiomycota mostly, and both of these groups actually contain the decomposer fungi. So we'll be looking at these in a little bit more detail later. But for now, we'll just concentrate on the Glomeromycota, which are the arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. Okay, so let's have a look at how fungi actually work. They have these extensive cells that are long, shaped like tubes, that are elongated in a tubular form, and actually access nutrients by expelling acids and enzymes onto the substrate that they want to consume, and gain nutrients by dissolving the substrate or the food source, and then actually absorbing through this hyphal cell, through the tip, the nutrients that they require. The hyphae, or the hyphal cells, have tubular organelles normally. So even though they're pictured here as spherical, they actually are tubular in form, which mimics the structure of the cell, which is quite elongated and grows at this tip. And then these organelles can actually interact within the cell and move nutrients and communication molecules back and forth within the cell and back to the older cells that are behind the growing tip. When several hyphae come together, they actually form what we called a mycelium. So basically, a mycelium is a conglomerate of individual hyphae coming together and forming a visible shape, visible structure that has this fractal geometric pattern, and we call this the mycelium, the fungal mycelium. So fungi are by nature very symbiotic types of organisms. All microbes are, just as we have learnt with bacteria in the previous unit. And one of the most greatest examples of this symbiosis is the formation of lichens, where oftentimes fungi that could live on their own form relationships with algae that could also live on their own. And they come together and incorporate many different microbe types, such as yeasts, which are also considered fungi, but they just don't have this filamentous growth of the hyphal system that we've just described. But also there's several bacteria and cyanobacteria. So these are photosynthetic bacteria, and algae also photosynthesize. So as these come together, they form this wonderful structure we call lichens, and the photosynthetic organisms, the cyanobacteria and algae, and either of those or one of those can be present in this symbiosis depending on the species. They actually photosynthesize, so they produce this carbon that they can then feed the fungi and yeast to and bacteria, and in exchange the fungi, yeast and bacteria will gain minerals and other substances that the cyanobacteria and algae would like to consume, and they exchange those nutrients. So they basically work together to live on a substrate, to hold themselves fastened and gain nutrients from the rock or other surfaces that they might be attached to, like soil, for example. Lichens grow on soil and trees, and then gain carbon through this photosynthetic process. And together, that nutrient distribution and this association and the interdependence keeps them together as what we call lichens. So besides the lichen symbiotic relationships that we see, and a very interesting notion is that before arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi actually were symbiotic with land colonizing plants, they have also been found to already be symbiotic in the more ancient pre-plant era. They have been found to be symbiotic with cyanobacteria, in particular Nostoc punctiforme, and Geosiphon piriformis, which is symbiotic with Nostoc, is the only living representative of a very ancient lineage of arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi called Geosiphonaceae. So basically, it is evident from the fossil record as well as a living example that arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi have always been in some form of symbiosis in order to gain photosynthetic carbon in exchange for the nutrients like phosphorus and other nutrients that they are able to exchange for that carbon that they gain from a photosynthetic organism. So I just wanted to basically explain that just to show how symbiotic fungi are. And that relationship also extends to plants, and that has always been the case where fungi and roots have partnered up in order for the plant to gain nutrients and then for the fungi to receive carbon-based compounds that they completely rely on for their livelihood. So this symbiosis called mycorrhiza or mycorrhizal symbiosis, myco meaning fungi and rhizal meaning root, exists on the majority of plants that are on Earth currently. There are only a few families of plants that don't form this mycorrhizal symbiosis. And in this particular case here, we've got the ectomycorrhizal fungi that produce the mushroom, the sporocarp, are associated with the tree roots. And they are asking this tree for the carbon, and the photosynthesis produces that liquid form of carbon that can be fed to the roots and then deposited and exchanged for minerals with the fungi. So fungi receive the photosynthetic sugar from the plant, amino acids and other compounds that are present in there, and the fungi actually mine nutrients from the soil and pass that on to their host plant. So, and of course, that implicates us as well because we actually excrete carbon dioxide and require oxygen, and plants, through the photosynthetic process, actually release oxygen. And of course, sunlight is implicated in this. So both water and sunlight are necessary, as well as carbon dioxide, for this beautiful system to function. And later on, we will look at also the decomposer group of fungi that actually transform the dead organic matter that has dropped down from the plant, which is then chopped up into smaller bits, and the nutrients from that can also be gained by these fungi and taken back to plants by these symbiotic mycorrhizal fungi. So it's a beautiful way of how the ecosystem functions, how the plant relationship with their fungi is so beautifully and closely intimate and produces this opportunity for life to exist on Earth. So the two main groups of mycorrhizal fungi or root symbiotic relationships that we will look at, there are many more. However, these are the two major groups and the most common types. So the arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, which we will talk about extensively, and they are the most ancient form, coming onto Earth about 450 million years ago with the advent of plant colonization on land. And then we've got this beautiful way that these fungi communicate with their host plant when the spore is in the soil, and the plant and the spore produce chemical signals to talk to each other, and this produces growth of the mycelium, or the hypha starts to grow, starts to develop from the spore and move towards the root, where it then can penetrate and intimately enter plant cell and form this little structure called arbuscule, or tiny tree inside the plant cell. So we will talk about this in more detail very soon. But I do want to flag, and we'll talk about this in our next lesson, that there's this also other relationship called the ectomycorrhiza, and this is where the cells of the mycorrhizal fungi actually proliferate outside. They don't go into the cell, but actually are present around the root cells. And then they also form this extensive mycelium network and then produce mushrooms as sporocarps. So they produce mushrooms to then disperse these spores, and we can call the mushroom structure a sporocarp, and that's where spores are released. So it's quite different, because arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi actually produce the spores straight off of their mycelium and actually only live in that form, and there's only maybe one species that produces some form of a sporocarp, whereas most of them just actually produce these spores straight from their hyphae, and that spore becomes the propagule, or the mechanism by which they infect other plants and create relationships with those plants. So these relationships are mutualistic, and that means both partners benefit, and they basically form these root extensions. You can see the mycelium is spreading out from the root, and they occur in over 90% of plants. So majority of plants on Earth actually have these relationships on their roots, and they provide the nutrient delivery exchange system, which is vital for both the plant and the fungi, and allow probably even up to 1,000 times more absorptive area than the roots themselves. They can actually get into nooks and crannies of soil aggregates and gain nutrients from there. They can extend quite far and wide depending on the species and the conditions within which the plant and the fungi are growing. And they ensure up to 20% faster plant growth as a result, as the plant continues to photosynthesize and draw down the carbon into its roots and provide that carbon in exchange for other nutrients to the mycorrhizal fungal partner. So this is what these relationships look like on the roots themselves. This is the arbuscular mycorrhizal hyphae extending from a plant root, and this is the ectomycorrhizal association. And you can see very well here how these three roots that are quite small on the seedling actually are then completely colonized and really embraced by this mycorrhizal network, the ectomycorrhizal fungal network. And you can see how much more area the plant can now absorb through this network of mycelium on its roots, which otherwise it would only gain very minimal nutrition just by having a few roots quite thick, and it's just not sustainable for the plant to grow in that way unless we fertilize it. So these fungal networks actually provide this nutrition to the plant. And you can see this carbon actually in the hyphae, present in the hyphae, and this is how we know that fungi are full of carbon, and that carbon can be translocated, and we can view this translocation to the plant by labeling this carbon. And you can see its transfer from the hyphae into the soil, but also from the plant into the hyphae. So, as I said earlier, these arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi are the ancient form of the symbiotic relationship between plant roots and fungal symbionts. And this relationship exists in over 80% of plants. So, some plants might have multiple species of these fungi on their roots, and they also might have, like an example would be some trees actually have the ectomycorrhizal fungi on their roots as well. So multiple variants and species of these fungi can actually collaborate with the plant, and some are very specific where only one plant and one fungal symbiont get together, whereas others have multiple relationships where many different fungal species can exist on the roots of the one plant species. What they provide is this fitness of the plant to be able to exploit or grow in its environment. And this goes all the way from the individual plant being able to survive and grow in a particular soil, in a particular environment, all the way to community level, where these fungi actually, with the plants, create the ability of that plant community to exist because they have these mycorrhizal fungi that are specific in that specific environment to allow the plant to function within its plant community, within its ecosystem. So the major group that majority of vascular plants associate with are the glomeromycotas, and these are the arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi that majority of plants actually have on their root system. So these guys are pretty prolific, and they partner up with many, many different plants. And in all, there are possibly about 300 species of arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi in 3 different families. And these are the different families with different examples of genera within these families. So basically, they are quite prolific, and they vary, and they actually, even though they occupy similar plant soil niche, their function actually varies quite a bit. And so there's still lots to be learned about arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi and the different families and how these specific families differ in function, because there's quite a bit of variability. So we can't just lump them into one and say, okay, arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, this is what they do. They actually have specificity and variability in their function. They can be considered as bioengineers because they drive below ground micro and mesoorganism community dynamics. So what this means is that they actually disperse nutrients and choose different organisms by how they share the nutrient from the plant, determining the microbial world around the plant, as well as the organisms that feed on the microbial world, the mesoorganisms that can actually feed on these fungi as well. And in fact, I think this is a little mite there that you can see, and these are spores being produced straight from the hyphae of the actual mycorrhizal fungi, and it is growing on a carrot root in culture. That's why it's nice and clean. And basically, you can't grow these without the plant, and this is very tricky for when we want to study these beautiful fungi. So yes, they are definitely bioengineers in the sense that they can drive what is going on below ground, and they're integral soil component, and they will not grow in very hostile soils. So they have their limits. However, they're also fantastic as bioremediators, so they allow plants to grow in pretty damaged soil conditions. So there's a lot of potential in how these fungi can be used in soil restoration efforts. They spread via hyphae, so these hyphae grow forward and spread throughout the soil as a network. And also because they produce these tiny arbuscules that we've already kind of looked at, but we'll look at more in detail. And these arbuscules can also be spread. Once the plant dies, they become an inoculant, as you will see also is the case with vesicles and spores. So they have various ways of dispersing, and we'll look at that soon. So the way it happens, the story of the mycorrhizal fungi and plant relationship, the beginnings are quite interesting. The spore sits in the soil, and it will receive a signal from the plant, and then it will start to germinate and then enter the plant cell. And so we'll look at that in a little bit as well. But also these hyphae are very absorptive, so they gain those nutrients. There's different functions of the different hyphae. So some produce spores, some will be these absorptive hyphae, and then the external mycelium or extra radical mycelium is growing outside of the plant cell or outside of the roots. So some of the storage structures, such as spores, are produced in soil, and the vesicles are produced actually inside the root. and they actually store different substances, different nutrients for the fungi to have a nutrient source. And also some of them have auxiliary bodies, which are just different types of structures that they produce in order to function. So let's look at now how this looks like inside the plant. So basically you can see here that this hypha goes inside into the plant, penetrates the root, goes inside and winds into the cells and around the cells. So I'll just show you that in more detail. So first of all, this aprosorium is formed, and this is like a little nodule or like a little structure that allows the hypha to actually get into the cells. So it's called an aprosorium, and it is at the entry point of when this plant fungi interaction starts to develop. So it penetrates between the epidermal cells and then goes into the intracellular section of the plant. So this is where it actually enters into the plant cell and can form an arbuscule inside the plant cell, just as seen here. There are also intercellular hyphae that grow in between cells, in the spaces between the cells. So intracellular is inside, extracellular is in between or outside of the cells. The arbuscule is actually intracellular, and also there are vesicles formed as well. And if you want to read more about it, you can actually download this really cool chapter from Microorganisms in Plant Conservation and Biodiversity. It's called Arbuscular Mycorrhizals in Plant Communities. So this is what it looks like when a micrograph is taken under the microscope. First of all, both the hyphae and the arbuscules as well as the vesicles have to be stained in order to be visualized. And this is often a very, very difficult process. And what I mean by difficult is it's a time-consuming, laborious process with chemicals being used, pretty harsh chemicals like boiling KOH. So it's not that easy to actually label these structures. And the reason for that is because there's layers of cells, especially in the older roots, and pigments and stuff. So you can't really see it. You have to strip with the KOH the root down to its bare minimal structure and then be able to visualize these arbuscules and other structures that the fungi form. So arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi are also very interesting genetically. One of those points of interest is that in old habitats, they remain genetically stable. They don't go through a lot of changes for potentially thousands of years. Their hyphae are capable of genetic exchange, but also they produced asexual spores. And it has been discovered that some spores do have the potential to become sexual. So asexual just means that there is no exchange, there is no sexual activity that needs to happen in order to reproduce progeny. So basically the hyphae just produce spores and those spores become the new progeny. There's no sex involved. However, some of the spores have been observed to potentially be able to be sexual. And I'm not sure how this is possible or how this happens, but it is a strange thing to have the potentiality to have the structures in the spore that would allow it for sexual reproduction. These spores are also multinucleate, and these nuclei are heterokaryotic. So what this means is that each spore has multiple, in fact up to 3,500 genetically distinct nuclei, and that's what heterokaryotic means, that they actually are different genetically to one another. So this is extremely strange because all other eukaryotic cells only possess one nucleus. So this poses a question as to why do they have these nuclei with this incredible diversity of genetic potential. And these organisms are obviously super, super important in terms of that plants can't really live without them. Majority of plants absolutely rely on these fungi to be present on their roots. So when very unfavorable conditions occur where these fungi struggle to survive, potentially this genetic variation available in order to make survival possible, when the genetic expression may allow these fungi to survive despite the potential of very drastic conditions that might be present in the future. They also have this ability to genetically change via hyphal anastomosis, and what that means is that two hyphae of the same species, when they meet, they might come together and grow in a parallel fashion, but they can also merge. So they've got this incredible potential to actually grow into one another, even though they might come from two different individuals, as long as they're of the same species. And when this merging of hyphae occurs, genetic recombination of the nuclei also might occur, or occurs as part of the anastomosis. So these creatures are extremely fascinating in the way that they are able to reproduce and how they have this genetic potential that is quite interesting, and the various ways in which those genes are exchanged. So as we can see, these organisms are very, very interesting, and there's way more to learn about them. So in the next lesson, we'll look at how arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi exchange nutrients. We'll look at their mycelium networks and how they function within ecosystems, and their methods of colonizing plants, as well as how they disperse. So I will end here, and I'll see you in lesson 4.2. Bye for now.